Nothing gives me much more joy than to see what students that I've been working with have taken on to write. And I would love to read a paragraph, a chapter, or something. But before you do, I want you to do one last program with Dawn Brotherton on how to get your book right. Dawn, you've got the stage.
Man, you really set me up. I don't know how I'm going to follow that. But, and I will say, I am going to be at the conference, but only on Thursday because I have an event and I've got to get back to Virginia on Saturday. So I hope to see you guys on Thursday. I'm planning on being there all day and staying for the mixer so that I can meet some people. So if you have any questions, feel free to come up and say hi to me so I can see you in person. All right. So let's get started. We've already talked about technique and content and some of the other things. I forgot to put my overall slide in here. Sorry. So I do encourage you, if you haven't seen them, go back and take a look. And all this stuff kind of fell into place. And we kind of did it in an order that follows along with the scoring for the MWSA awards. So we had some of that in mind as we were looking at this. So let's go into this with the ease of reading. What we're talking about here is some people as readers aren't going to notice if you have your commas wrong or if you didn't indent your first paragraph of your chapter and those kind of things. But they will notice if they get jerked out of the story. If they're reading along, and I'm sure you've read books like this before, where you're reading along and all of a sudden the author seems to have gone off on a tangent and you've lost track of what is happening in the story. That's what I'm talking about. You need to be able to stay focused and stay in your story. Now, when you're writing your first draft, get it out and just write it. But when you're going back through and you're picking out what to keep and what to get rid of, keep that in mind. Is it important to the story? Does it move it along? Did it pull you out of the story and take you somewhere else? If so, think really hard before you keep that one. And if, as a reader, again, I'm sure you've done this before where you've lost track of what they're talking about. And you had to go back a few pages and figure out who that character was or how they connected. If you've seen things like that, that means they've missed something in the flow. We did talk about it before, but keep in mind with the ease of reading that shorter sentences make action happen quicker. So if you're in a fight scene, you're going to be using shorter sentences, more to the point, not very much description. But you can't write at that level all the time because the reader will be on edge all the time. So the idea is to have the flow. And we talked about that in one of the previous videos. But shorter sentences make the action go faster. Slower sentences kind of give you a breather and slow things down. Shorter paragraphs are good for the brain. It helps, and this goes especially for nonfiction. When you're trying to teach people something and you're trying to get something across, shorter paragraphs and a lot more white space help give the brain a rest and let things sink in so people can remember what they're supposed to be hearing. Shorter chapters are also good these days for our attention spans because just overall with, you've heard it, the digital, the phones and all that, people like to do things in chunks. I know my husband cannot sit down to dinner unless he has finished the chapter in his book. He has to wait till he gets to the end of the chapter. So for people like that, you want to keep your chapters a decent length. And by short, I'm talking, 5-6 pages, not 20 pages. Also, you have to think about what is the appropriate length. Genres have different word counts. Everything goes by word count. We've talked about that. Everything goes by word count in the publishing world. So genres have certain word counts. And like Jack was saying about before you break out and try to do something new, when you're first starting out, you really need to stick within those word counts and you need to follow the trend. Because if you're trying to pitch to a big publisher and it's a contemporary fiction, which is supposed to be around 80 to 90,000 words, and you give them 150,000 words, they're going to disregard you right off the bat. Now, once you're J.K. Rowling and you're famous, you can write as long as you want. But in the meantime, when you're first starting out, you need to know what those word counts are. Google it. It's all over the internet where you can find the window of word counts. And as far as, and you won't find one for nonfiction, by the way. There's not really a set word count for, like if you're writing an instruction manual or something like that, but there is for, and not for poetry either, but there is for fiction books, novels. When it comes to organization, obviously people understand that in nonfiction, you have to be very organized. You have to make sure that it flows when you're teaching something, that they build on each other, that it makes sense. But it also is very important in fiction writing, because that first sentence or two in the first paragraph of every chapter should kind of give you an idea of where you are, who and where you are. So if you go from person to person, if you're changing points of view, starting out that very first sentence in every chapter should kind of give you an idea of whose point of view you're writing from and where you are. Are you at the house? Are you at the lake? Are you back in time at a medieval castle? It needs to tell you something just very simply of where you are. Sometimes people try to get away with that with just doing the heading, and they name their chapter and they put that little medieval times or whatever. That is, personally, when I read, I tend to blow past those often, unless I'm lost and then I have to go back and figure it out. You still need to put it in that first paragraph. You have to set the stage in that first paragraph. When I say words matter, it says so much more, because it matters in your vocabulary at the right reading level. So people understand that when you're writing for a child, you have to write at a certain level and use only certain vocabulary. And there's formulas out there for that. There's stuff on Pinterest, actually. You can Google subject words that kids are supposed to read at a certain age, and that will help. And I'm telling you, I'm working on my children's book right now, and it is just as hard as writing a novel, because I'm trying to do rhyming and trying to find words that rhyme that kids can still read is not easy. But you got to think about that for young adults as well as when you get into adults. And just because you can use a big word, some authors, you will hear it said that they tend to show off because they're using all the big vocabulary. If you use a big vocabulary just for the sake of using it, it's a little showy and it's off-putting, because people aren't going to understand. They're going to get lost in your book and they're going to get bored with you. That does not mean you cannot use big words or words that not everybody knows. The way kids learn to read is by reading words that they don't know and then figuring out from the context. So that is perfectly fine, and you can do that. You just don't want to do it all the time. And you might have a character who is a doctor or a big show-off, and they do use big words all the time. As long as the reader can figure it out from the context, that's what you need. So just keep that in mind. The source is your friend. Wordhippo.com, I highly recommend that website. It's free. It's a lot of fun. It gives synonyms, antonyms, rhyming, a bunch of things. One of the things in your book flow, and now I'm going to talk fiction mostly right here, is the narration versus the dialogue. And you need to have a balance. Dialogue tends to move action faster. So you feel like you're in the thick of things when you are in the middle of a conversation, when you are listening to a conversation. And you can have your characters can use improper grammar if that is part of the way that they speak, and that's fine. Don't spell it wrong. I mean, you can spell it with the slang, you've seen it sometimes with the apostrophe because they y'all, that kind of thing. That's fine. That's not what I mean. I mean, you don't misspell the word weather just because they don't speak right. Because it's spelled, it sounds the same, so spell it correctly. That's kind of what I mean by improper spelling is not okay. But you do need that mixture of narration and dialogue. And I proofed a book very recently where they like had one line of dialogue and a bunch of descriptive words and then one line of dialogue, and that was it. Well, that was kind of useless. You need to be, a dialogue is back and forth. It's not just one person saying one thing and moving on. I'm sure you have all heard the term showing versus telling, but some people don't really know what that means, or they don't necessarily want to admit that they don't know what that means. But telling is basically when the author uses a description to tell the reader what's happening instead of letting the characters in the story explain what's happening. And I've got some examples to show you. Okay, so in a telling example, John was sad to see his girlfriend leave. That is just the author just coming right out and telling you what you should think about this. But if you show that John is sad by he's wiping his white tears down his face as he watches his girlfriend board the plane. Okay, so now you can infer from that John is sad. The author did not have to come right out and tell you that. And then you can see my example about the creepy house. And you can tell why one is so much more expressive than the other. Some ways to turn a tell into a show are to use really strong verbs. So don't just use the word walk if somebody galloped or skipped or sauntered or strolled or ambled. Try to use that thesaurus and use something more than just went from one place to the next. And descriptive words are really nice. So instead of just saying that Grandma baked a pie, you might say that the cinnamon apple pie with the golden crust rested on the windowsill above the sink. So then you can see it, you can smell it almost with the cinnamon. Speaking of which, go ahead and include the sensory smells or the sensory details. So how does something smell? What sounds did they hear? Did the door creak instead of just open? Those kind of things. When you need to get information out, like character traits, because we talk about backstory, when you need to get across the fact that somebody has long blonde hair, you don't just come right out and say, Ari had long blonde hair. But it might be she pushed her long hair back out of her face. It was getting so long she needed a haircut. That kind of weaves it in rather than just giving the information straight out. When it comes to backstory, a lot of times you need character development. We talked about that. And one of the ways you do character development is with the backstory. Not every piece of what is in your brain as part of backstory needs to be on the paper, but you need to be able to weave it in when it's important. So if somebody had an abusive childhood, the author doesn't just come right out and write into a narrative because they had an abusive childhood, blah, 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 blah. You do more of the weaving by maybe they had a conversation with a friend where they were talking about it. Or maybe she remembers something, or she jumps at a sound and it reminds her of something that happened in the past. And some people use flashbacks. That's okay for a little bit, not very often. And it's kind of out of vogue right now. That doesn't mean it won't come back into style. But flashbacks are not really a great way. It's almost like a cheating way to get the backstory in there. So if you can think of a better way to bring it up, a memory, a conversation. So the difference between a flashback and a memory is a flashback is like you cut the scene and you go into the past and they act out the scene. Where a memory is you basically say she remembered when blah, blah, blah. That's kind of the difference. And it's shorter. A memory is shorter than a flashback can take a whole chapter sometimes. And again, you describe the setting, the scene setting, instead of talking about the rolling hills and the sky was blue, have the character describe that. She looked out the window and saw the cars the size of an ant, the size of ants outside her window or something like that. So describe the setting that you want to portray through the eyes of the character. That goes back to the showing versus telling thing. And you don't have to do it all at once. Back in the day, in a lot of the classics, you'll see the first 3 chapters are nothing but scene setting or world building in the case of Tolkien and those kind of things. Not so much anymore because people are bored with that. They want to get to the meat. So if you can put it in a little bit at a time over through conversations and throughout the chapter, that's a better way. I did go into a whole lot of detail about this in one of the previous videos, so I don't really want to get into it now, but anytime you can eliminate extra words, please do so. When you're writing initially and you're writing your first draft, just go ahead and write and don't worry about this. When you go back to clean up, you want to do some of these searches. Do a control find and search for some of these things and cut them wherever you can. And you don't want to be repetitive. That annoys me to death when people harp on things like how nervous somebody is, or I'm so scared, I'm so scared, I'm so scared. Okay, I got you're scared. Move on. Give me something else. Describe jumping at the sound of boo, or the creepy, why are you scared? Give me something more instead of repeating it. And sometimes people get stuck with always describing a person the same way. The old man in suspenders. And if you always describe the same guy as the old man in suspenders, it gets really annoying. Either give him our name or give him some different characteristic or do something, change up the wording a little bit. But the common descriptions over and over are frustrating. And when you state the obvious, you are treating your reader like they're stupid. So if you just wrote this great scene, like we saw earlier about how creepy and scary something was, and then you have your character say, this is really scary, then you've kind of said out loud what the audience, the reader should be figuring out for themselves. So you really don't want to do that. You also want to avoid bouncing around the timelines. When I say be methodical, I mean, if you have in your book and you're going back and forth between timelines, that's fine. If you have a plan to it, like in my most recent book, Eastover Treasure, we're in contemporary times, then they go back to Civil War for a chapter, and then contemporary, then Civil War, then contemporary. But it's broken up by chapter and it's methodical. I did it on purpose like that. By bouncing around the timeline, I mean, 1 minute we're with Susie and it's Tuesday, and then the next time we look, it's John is Monday the day before, and and it gets confusing for the reader to try to keep track of who is doing what when. And yes, I have seen this happen. So it's very frustrating. So again, when you're writing, this is one of those things you go back and you check for later. And one of the things that I have found extremely helpful is when I'm done with my first draft, even, is I go back and I outline my own book that I just finished, because that helps me fill up plot holes. But it also helps with this timeline thing, because if you fix something over here, you caught something, you go, oh, I need to give her more character development or something. So let's have her go on a date, and you have it happen in this chapter. Well, you might have just messed up your timeline somewhere else. So going back after the fact and outlining it and putting in your timeline, that will help you figure out and make sure you don't do this bouncing. if you are writing in third person, don't let your narrator sneak in things like, little did she know the robbers were just around the corner. It's a technique. And if you're doing it on purpose, okay, but it's not very popular as a technique goes. You'll see this with kids' books sometimes. But to me, again, I kind of feel like if she didn't know, then don't tell me, because I want to be surprised when the character is surprised. So you're ruining the surprise by making a comment like this. And you're pulling the reader out of the story and reminding them that there's a narrator, there's an author that is driving the story, instead of letting them get lost in where they are and being with the character. Kind of like this is the fourth wall. And some of you might have heard of breaking the fourth wall. It happens in plays sometimes. Some comedies on TV, you'll see it. And it's one of those where they go, and little did they know, but then the author or the character, and what I'm talking about, is talking to the audience intentionally, but they're totally pulled out of character and they're talking to you. Again, it's used in comedies, but if it is used unintentionally, it looks like a mistake and it totally pulls the reader out. I put a link in here because this website gives a really good pro and con on when to break the fourth wall and when you should do it and when you shouldn't. The Book Thief is an example of an author that does break the fourth wall very well, but the author is deaf. So there's personification in there. So there's a real specific reason that they did that. So I highly recommend this website. Now we're going to talk about active versus passive voice. Again, this is one of those things that people hear all the time. Don't do it, don't do it. But they don't necessarily know that they're doing it because they don't understand what it means. So it is okay to use passive voice once in a while, like I said, for artistic effect. If you do it on purpose and it's to give a little bit of difference, then you're okay. But here's an example. And what you want to look for to determine if it's active or passive voice is you're looking for the subject and the verb. So in this case, it's passive. Woven into the thread at the bottom was a delicate ring of gold. So the delicate ring of gold is what was woven. So that's why this is passive. It's backwards. It should be written in an active voice, a delicate ring of gold from which vines of gold, it's kind of redundant with the word gold, sorry about that, wandered up toward her waist, was woven into the thread at the bottom. Okay, so you get the idea. It's switching it. Now the first one sounds very poetic, and that's great as long as you don't do it all the time. If it's an intentional once in a while, then you're fine with passive voice. I'm sure we're going to have a lot more questions on that one. That was pretty much all I had for you guys as far as content goes. And I'm going to stop sharing. This is my website. If you guys have any questions or you want to send me an email, some of you have reached out after some of the other videos, and I really appreciate that very much. So I do welcome you guys to reach out and ask me questions or correct me. I'm good with that too.
Okay. Well, Dawn, thank you very, very, very much.